Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah, this is Mujeeb Kazi. You're watching Washington Roundtable from the studio of Washington, D.C. I'm very delighted to have a very special guest with us who is going to talk about situation ever changing in Afghanistan, obviously Kashmir, and we will slightly touch on the entire South Asia development, what's happening. And that is none other than our very dear friend, and very grateful that he has given time from his very valuable schedule, who would be joining us today to discuss on the show. Michael Kugalman, who is the Deputy Director of the Asia Program and the Senior Associate for the South Asia at the Wilson Center. He is the leading specialist on Afghanistan, Kashmir, and Pakistan. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be back with you.
Well, we have seen Afghanistan is keeping all of us busy and situation is changing almost on a daily basis. But just for the understanding of our audience, for the world, particularly the Western world, what is the takeaway from this episode of Afghanistan where we have fought a 2 decade of long war, spent over $2 trillion, lost a lot of human lives? What is the takeaway?
Well, I think the very basic takeaway is that the U.S. is very good at starting wars, but it's not very good at bringing them to an end, and especially on terms that work in the U.S.'s favor. I mean, that's very clear. We know that the U.S. achieved its initial goals in the war during the very early weeks of the war, when it eliminated the Al-Qaeda sanctuaries in Afghanistan and removed their Taliban hosts from power. And then we've had this nearly 20-year period where the U.S. Successive U.S. governments were unable to clearly articulate a strategy for why Americans continue to fight, and it's very difficult to wage a successful war when you don't have a clear strategy animating it. So, and of course, that's only one. There's so many reasons why we could to chalk up so many reasons why the U.S. War failed. But I think the basic one is that there was this extended period of mission creep, and the U.S. simply wasn't able to come up with the right strategy. The default strategy was just to keep fighting and hope that eventually you put the Taliban on the defensive and put it in a position where it would be willing to come into negotiations with the Americans, with the Afghan government. But clearly the Taliban outlasted so many different U.S. administrations, and it's now in a position where it's back in power. And so, in other words, the U.S. left Afghanistan knowing that the Taliban, the very entity that had come to Afghanistan to remove, is now back in power. So it's really a sobering defeat, that's for sure.
So, do you think that in that case, U.S. will ever come back and admit that the war that was started 20 years ago was not just unwinnable?
Well, I think so. It may take some time. I think that you'd have to wait until, prominent personalities start writing their memoirs, and at that point, then they could acknowledge the failures. But, I think that, we're still at a point now where all of the presidents involved in this war, from Bush over to Biden, I think that everyone's going to continue to say that we did our best and so on and so forth. But yeah, you could place failure on the doorstep of place blame on the doorstep of so many different administrations here. Credit the Trump administration for finally recognizing on a formal level that the war could not be won militarily, right? It was Donald Trump that resolved to do whatever was necessary to get negotiations going with the Taliban. And that had not happened before. There had been some opportunities to launch negotiations with the Taliban, but the U.S. government at the time, for whatever reason, didn't want to follow through. So it was President Trump that decided to pursue negotiations, though you could look at this very cynically and conclude that he just wanted to get out. He wanted Americans to get out. He knew he needed political cover for that, and he got it by launching negotiations with the Taliban, resulting in a deal that compelled U.S. troops to leave, with knowing that the Taliban would not be attacking them as they left. So that's the political cover he was looking for, and he got it.
Well, there was only two leaders in the world who were talking about that the only way we can make settlement in Afghanistan would be through peace and talks and negotiation. One was Donald Trump, and the second one was Imran Khan of Pakistan, who has been all along saying that the only solution in Afghanistan would be to have a negotiation. So basically, their assessment was pretty much correct, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with him, with Imran Khan, in the sense that the best time to launch negotiations would have been earlier on in the war, when the U.S. still had influence and still had leverage over the Taliban, particularly because it had tens of thousands of troops in the country. The troop posture was clearly the U.S.'s most powerful tool of leverage vis-a-vis the Taliban. And, you know, once the U.S. started negotiating toward the end, when it was just not doing very well, and the Taliban was so emboldened, and Afghan forces were really struggling. And then, as the negotiations continued toward an outcome in which the Taliban knew that U.S. forces were leaving, then yeah, I mean, the U.S. and the Afghan government had no leverage at all. But I would argue that yes, I do agree with Prime Minister Khan's statements. But one could argue that some of Pakistan's own decisions and policies perhaps contributed to a state of affairs on the battlefield that made it more difficult for the U.S. to get to a point where negotiations would be viable. If you're trying to identify the different reasons why the Taliban was able to become and remain so strong on the battlefield, I think you have to look at those safe havens that the leadership enjoyed for Pakistan for quite a few, for nearly 20 years. But yeah, I give credit to Prime Minister Khan in this regard for being right and saying that yeah, negotiations were the way to go, but they should have happened much earlier in the war when the U.S. actually had leverage.
Great. Well, now that has have become a thing of the past, so we have to move forward. So, what is your assessment? Should the Western world, or for that matter, even the entire world, should they accept the current government of Taliban now, or should they wait? And what would be the consequences of waiting and delaying? And what would be the benefit of accepting it, the reality on the ground now, and start to work with them for the benefit of the people of Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think you've laid out the answer very nicely there. That if we agree that recognizing the Taliban, engaging formally with the Taliban means aid, foreign assistance, because it's more likely that a country is going to provide foreign assistance to the Taliban government after it recognizes it. If we agree to that link, then I think it's very risky for the world to hold back and not engage formally with the Taliban, just because the humanitarian crisis is so severe, the economic crisis is so severe. The Taliban government needs foreign assistance, and it knows that it's been sanctioned by the West. About $10 billion in foreign reserves have been cut off to the Afghan government, to the Taliban government. So they really need the foreign assistance. And if you have a critical mass of countries that recognize the Taliban government, then foreign assistance will start to roll in, which means hopefully some relief for the Afghan people. But that said, there are risks of sort of jumping in and recognizing the Taliban so quickly. You could argue that the issue of legitimacy and recognition is a form of leverage for the international community, that it could try to wait and insist on a number of conditions from the Taliban before countries are willing to recognize the Taliban. So, for instance, assurances that the Taliban will go after terrorist organizations, that it will bring some degree of inclusivity into the government, that it will ensure that all girls, regardless of age, can go to school, and that only when there's evidence that the Taliban is letting those things happen, only then will there be formal recognition. But again, this then gets into rather tricky, controversial issues about the risk of conditioning assistance on other things happening. And I think that making aid or money or food assistance, that type of thing, making that conditional, that's not fair, right? I mean, Afghan people don't deserve to be caught up in this. They deserve assistance that can bring them relief. So that's why I think the middle ground issue, the best workaround to this conundrum, is to work on arrangements for countries to provide humanitarian assistance to the Afghans that doesn't run through the Taliban government. So this essentially means coordinating with the UN and international relief agencies to ensure that you can get enough relief and assistance into the country in ways that circumvent the government. And that will require engaging with the Taliban to make sure that works. Will the Taliban allow for that? I don't know. I'd like to hope it will. But I think that's really the best path forward. Try to provide as much financial assistance as possible without while ensuring that none of it ends up in Taliban hands.
So everything that you have said makes sense. Do you think the most of the responsibility of taking it forward from this point onwards, is that the responsibility of the countries that surrounds the region, or U.S. still should be leading the effort to? I know President Biden does not like to use the word rebuilding and uh, bringing retraining and all that, but at the same time, leaving them or abandoning the country, don't you think that would be a risk for the stability and the peace of the world in the region?
Yes, I think the responsibility for assisting Afghanistan lies with as many countries as possible. Certainly the NATO countries, the U.S. and the other NATO countries, because these are the countries that wage the war, for sure. But I think also the region, just because the region, unlike the U.S. and the other NATO countries, it doesn't have the luxury of leaving and withdrawing when it's concluded it's done all it can do. The regional countries are stuck with the implications of the U.S. withdrawal, and they will bear the brunt of any spillover effects that come from a more destabilized Afghanistan. So, if the economic crisis doesn't get any better, if the humanitarian crisis doesn't get any better, you could see increased refugee flows. And of course, the first place so many of these Afghans will try to go is across the border to Iran, to Pakistan, some of the countries in Central Asia as well and beyond. And so I think that's why the regional players have a particular stake in making something work here, with coming together with a plan. And you look at other consequences like drug trade. If you have stepped up destabilization, then you have to worry about the drug trade picking up. And you've got so many countries surrounding Afghanistan that have pretty significant heroin crises, and much of the heroin in these countries is sourced from Afghanistan. And these are not problems that the U.S. has to deal with directly because it's hundreds of miles away. So I think that we need to see as many countries as possible getting involved in efforts to bring relief to the Afghans. And to its credit, the Biden administration in recent days has announced an aid package of about $65 million, which is great, and that's a start. But clearly more needs to be done. The final point on this, it's not the regional players that have sanctioned the Taliban government. It's the U.S. and the West. They're the ones that have cut off all this money. So I think that sort of speaks to, again, to the need for the U.S. and its NATO partners and its Western partners to do more to ensure that the miseries that risk prevailing with the Afghan people, in part because of these sanctions, the key is to ensure that those miseries are eased by separate U.S. humanitarian assistance that does not go through the Taliban government.
You have touched upon a very grave concern about the UNDCP report of, opium growing in the country. And unfortunately, over the period of the war, in 20 years, I was looking at the numbers reported by the UNDP. It was 3,300 tons per year in 2000, and now it has gone to 7,000 tons per year. So that would be a grave problem, not only for the country itself, but also around the world, because eventually they will start making money out of smuggling it out of the country and funneling it through different channels. So that would be a disaster for the world. So I think the best thing would be to engage with the Taliban now, then later to counter it, because they had somewhat control over it. Don't you think so?
Well, it's I don't know if they had control. Well, they did have control over it in the sense that they had a lot of influence over the drug trade. And the Taliban made a lot of money off the drug trade. But in recent weeks, they've claimed that they're going to ban poppy production in Afghanistan. Now, the drug trade was already illicit in Afghanistan, but if it's now being formally banned, then that means that it'll become all the more illicit. And I fear that it's going to be difficult. It's hard to believe that the drug trade will actually come to a grinding halt, just because the nature of the private sector in Afghanistan is such that you have relatively few legal industries that are in a growth pattern, right? I mean, poppy production has always been so effective, and it's provided a good livelihood for many poor farmers. And so unless the Taliban has some type of new alternative livelihood program to roll out here after it bans the poppy production, these farmers are going to be in a very tough spot. And I think that unless the Taliban were actually to start using violence against them if they keep farming, um, I think that you're going to continue to see drug trade, even if it's formally banned. I'm actually surprised the Taliban has decided to ban it. The Taliban must recognize that it makes a contribution to the economy, even if it's an illicit one. There's nothing ideologically that suggests for the Taliban that drugs have to be banned. That's never been an issue. So it's a bit surprising, but yeah, I think that we have to worry that it could get worse. Not as bad as if the war were still continuing, because I think the war, that sort of exacerbates the drug trade as well. So the fact that the conflict, at least for now, is done with, bringing a bit more stability suggests that hypothetically there could be more opportunities for people to find other sources of income away from the drug trade. But it's going to be tough, because I don't see this as something that's going to go away, even if the Taliban says it will.
I'm going to come back to the women's right issue that the West and particularly entire world is uh, pretty much talking about it. So on these questions, the Western countries expect. Do you think they are too hasty to expect overnight change in their attitude, or should the Taliban be given the chance to adopt an approach that is consistent with the social values while being respectful for the women's right, education, employment, sports, and travel, and etc.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really think that the Taliban's basic worldview has changed when it comes to its ideologies, including women's rights. I hope I'm wrong. I think that if you want to look for silver linings, well, yes. I mean, the Taliban has not cracked down as extensively on women in the public space as had been the case in the 90s, right? I mean, you have women that are still out there, particularly in the cities, though they're wearing many more head coverings than they used to. But you look at the edicts from the Taliban in recent days. One of them being that girls older than the seventh grade cannot. They basically have not been told they could come to school. That's very concerning. You have to hope that changes. But that clearly is very concerning for now. Um, and similarly, the fact that most women have not been invited to come to work. It's only women in health ministries and a few others that have been called in. So that's very troubling, to say the least. I do not think that Western countries can use aid as leverage here. I think it would be wildly inaccurate to suggest that if the U.S. were to condition aid to the Taliban on um, uh, showing that women's rights will be respected, I don't think that would work. I think that the Taliban is not going to compromise on its fundamental ideological views. You could talk about how there's sort of a competition here between ideological necessity, or should I say ideological belief, and sort of practical necessity. This idea that on the one hand, the Taliban does have to make compromises if it wants to get foreign assistance, recognition from much of the world, but it's not going to be willing to make concessions on some of its basic ideological positions. And I think that the Taliban recognizes that it will eventually get recognition from a number of governments that will not demand those assurances on rights for women and inclusivity. And that, I think, further diminishes potential U.S. leverage, or the leverage of any country that seeks to put women's rights down as a condition for foreign assistance.
I'm going to digress towards Kashmir now, but before I talk about Kashmir, I want to draw your attention, and I'm sure you're aware of it, that how concerned are you or the U.S. policymakers about the encroachment of Hindutva supremacy in the U.S.? And I'm saying this out of respect for our associate who is a professor at the New Jersey University, Dr. Audrey Churuska, and she, in her recent blog, has mentioned that because she openly talks about it, and it's a danger, and that's a research that she does, but she is being threatened so much that even if he has to go and speak at any university level, she has to have a police and guard surrounds her so she can be protected. How concerned are you, and how serious this threat is for the U.S. here in locally? And of course, we can go back and talk about what it has done to the country itself, particularly towards the minorities in India and in Kashmir.
Yeah, no, it's very concerning. The fact that you've had a series of academic conferences in the U.S. recently, that the participants were harassed and trolled and abused horrifically on social media, received threats. There's no way that that could be justified at all. And indeed, I guess it's a microcosm of how things are playing out in India as well, where you have the stepped up efforts to crack down on any form of dissent. It's very concerning. I think that this is certainly something that the U.S. is aware of, for sure. This is not new. This goes back several years. Will this become a big issue on the agenda for Washington and the U.S.-India relationship? Likely not, just because of the nature of the relationship and how the U.S. is keen on making it work come what may because of strategic imperatives, mainly those that revolve around China and the conclusion that India is an essential partner in U.S. efforts to counterbalance China in the region. So I don't necessarily see much coming from the administration in terms of complaints or anything like that. This is unfortunately a new normal, so to speak, and it's hard to imagine. Well, let me put it this way: I just don't see this as something that's going to be high on the agenda of U.S. officials. It's very troubling, but at the end of the day, I think there's not much that can be done about it. Certainly, you could look at the potential for human rights organizations and others outside of government to bring attention to what's going on. There's been a fair amount of foreign media coverage, and I think U.S. media coverage on this harassment of scholars who are critics of India here in the U.S. And that's important for sure. And this is something that India never likes. India always is very critical of any type of foreign commentary or on foreign media that's critical of things that India does or its internal policies, that type of thing. But I think that you need to maintain a focus on this, and that's why the international media is critical in continuing to bring attention to these issues, if for nothing else, to make sure that New Delhi knows that the world is aware of what's happening and that it's very troubling.
That is very unfortunate and very contradicting to what President Biden has been saying about the human rights. And it's not even, just like you have alluded to, it's not even part of the agenda. I mean, that's what we are assuming, that it's not part of the agenda. If it was, then probably it would not be invited in the White House. But you do know that one time, the very, I would say, head of the RSS was the Modi, who was banned at one time to enter in the U.S. He was, because currently he travels on the impunity of diplomatic passports. Otherwise, he would not be allowed to enter in the U.S. because of his very crime that he committed when he was the chief minister of Gujarat back in the days. But it was very unfortunate and contradicting. Speaking about human rights violation in Kashmir, from your last interview, there was one comment that I want to bring about to your attention. It was President Wilson who introduced the word self-determination for the Balkan countries. And there was a criticism on the Woodrow Wilson Center that currently the Woodrow Wilson Center does not support the right of self-determination. Is that a true statement? If it is not, then how supportive of it is to carry out the legacy of the president who was the reason for inception of this center?
Yeah, that's interesting. So going back to your first question about how what I said about democracy and rights not being on the agenda of the Biden administration, how that goes against its principles. Yes, this is very true. Indeed, this is an administration that's claimed that it's going to put rights and democracy at the forefront of its foreign policy. But I think what's become very clear, that this is not a surprise, is that everything comes down to interest and real politics, so to speak. That this administration is going to really focus hard on democracy and human rights in countries that are rivals of the U.S. or that are not strategic partners, right? Countries like China, for example. The Uyghur issue will be a big deal. The U.S. will not be afraid to call out the egregious rights violations in Myanmar. But India is different, right? Because it's a country that the U.S. looks at from a very strategic lens. And it does not want to alienate India and does not want to imperil the relationship because it sees New Delhi as a key partner in efforts to push back against China. I mean, there's certain issues that I think could provoke some type of U.S. Some type of Biden administration comments, such as, the for Biden, I know that on very personal levels, he's very troubled about the increasingly authoritarian use of technology. So internet bans, that's something that he and his administration are very concerned about. And of course, India is the internet ban capital of the world, I believe. And they had imposed the longest ever internet ban in Kashmir, right? So I think that if you start to see more of these bans emerge in India or anywhere in India, I think that that's something that you could expect the administration to bring up publicly as well to a degree. But yeah, for the most part, you're not going to see this government articulate all that much public criticism about India's human rights record for the reasons that I mentioned, interest, realpolitik. Now, in terms of the Wilson Center question, that's an interesting question. I'd be curious who made the point. But no, you're right. We don't take any position. I mean, the Wilson Center institutionally is nonpartisan, so it doesn't take any type of position on anything, whether it's self-determination for Kashmir or what the U.S. should do about this country, what type of policy the U.S. should have in X country. There are no positions. And so then, I think the question then becomes, well, what about the individual scholars and analysts that are based at the Wilson Center? What's their take on this issue? Mm-hmm. And I myself have always taken a position which is actually in line with the position of many others, that I don't want to take a position. I'd rather not sort of get dragged into it, and I'd rather sort of stay above the fray and work as an analyst to sort of see how the Kashmiris and the Indians and the Pakistanis look at the issue and base analyses on that. So that's pretty much what it comes down to. So yeah, you're sort of correct in that the Wilson Center has not endorsed the idea of self-determination for Kashmiris, but at the same time, it also has not endorsed the opposite too. It's taken no position because it's not allowed to take positions on foreign policy issues.
So I know we are so much. I am already over the time that I promised with you, but I just cannot resist asking this last question if you choose to answer. Do you think the fall of Afghanistan will have any implication in Kashmir?
Well, I think that there's a very real question is worth asking. Well, there are two key questions. One is the Taliban, how it relates to Kashmir, and the other issue is more broad. So the Taliban issue. So as you know, for many years the Taliban has publicly distanced itself from the Kashmir dispute, and it's said that it's for India and Pakistan to work out. But in recent weeks, we've heard messaging from Taliban leaders indicating that yes, we are going to speak out on behalf of the Muslims of Kashmir. That's a new position to be taken publicly. So what that actually means, I don't know, and especially given that the Taliban is probably going to be a pariah state in the eyes of much of the world, it's not going to be recognized by a huge number of countries. It may be difficult for the Taliban to sort of project that argument, especially on the world stage. And you're not going to have the Taliban representing Afghanistan at the UN, or at least anytime soon. So that'll be a bit of a challenge to put it mildly. But the fact that at least rhetorically they've been indicating their support for Kashmir or for the quote Muslims of Kashmir, so that's significant. The other question is what the Taliban victory means for how other militant groups look at Kashmir. So if you look at groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba, these are groups that have been Kashmir focused for quite some time. If they feel sufficiently emboldened and inspired by what the Taliban did in Afghanistan, Could groups like that be prompted to try to carry out attacks in India? I don't know, but it certainly is something. It's certainly something worth thinking about. I mean, I know that India is going to be very concerned about security risks in Kashmir post Taliban takeover for the reasons that I mentioned. But there's other issues here that get to issues of capacity. Do these groups have the capacity to carry out attacks in Afghanistan, in Kashmir, especially if they've been, for those of them that have been based in Afghanistan? Um, would Pakistan try to curb these groups before they try to do something? Would it have the capacity to try to curb these groups? So there are a lot of different issues here, but I think for me the biggest question here goes back to the first thing I said: the fact that the Taliban is now publicly speaking out on behalf of Kashmiris. That's very interesting and somewhat new. So it'll be interesting to see where that leads, if anywhere.
But at the same time, both countries, Pakistan and Afghanistan, both have claimed that they will not let anybody use their soil to carry out attacks on any other country. So that might be on the diplomatic level only. I'm assuming. So I'm just speaking as an outsider. Uh, so don't you think so? What that is that what they meant by when they said that they would support uh, the movement in Kashmir for freedom?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was meant as a message of solidarity with the Muslims of Kashmir. You know, the Taliban has not come out to offer expressions of support for Muslims anywhere in the world outside of Afghanistan. Um, it hasn't really said much about the Palestinians. Until recently, it hadn't said much about Kashmiris. So, but yeah, to your point, yes, I mean, the Taliban does claim that it won't let its territory be used by others to create or cause instability. But there's no indication that the Taliban has tried to limit what Al Qaeda can do. So this will be an ongoing challenge for the international community, especially for Pakistan, to try to get the Taliban to ensure that it doesn't provide support to these international terrorist organizations.
Michael, thank you so much. Thank you for being on the show. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.